And lastly, what will be the biggest challenge for communicators of my generation?
I think the real question is how to reconceptualize the relationship between social networks, the new social media, and the classic media of broadcasting and newspapers. It's first of all, what's going to happen?
Well, that's
about
English.
English. Well, I think I should show the picture of Elihu and Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion was looking, he was a great reader and philosophers and so on. And here he's presenting these books that Ben Gurion looked for and giving it to Ben Gurion. And at his parents' home, there was a big picture of Elihu and Ben Gurion, but most people didn't quite know what it was all about, and they recognized Elihu and used to say, well, that's Elihu, but who is this other man? Which is very funny. I don't know, Elihu lasted with me many decades, and partially because we married young, and we constituted for each other a significant audience. I mean, we weren't busy only to impress our colleagues, but to impress each other. But I want also to add to this the fact that Elihu was also a great consumer of culture, which is not well known among his colleagues. I don't think we would have lasted together if it weren't the case, because my interests were not necessarily just in communication, but culture at large, so that Elihu was just as interested in concerts, in theater, in museums, traveling to different places, seeing the achievements in art.
I actually have a small item on my phone, I think, from, here we are. Yeah, this is the last course Elihu taught during COVID last year. We're at his home. Here's the class, some 24 students. And Elihu was discussing the book of Esther. He knew the text by heart. And another thing you'll see, another very Elihu aspect, he makes his point and immediately moves the discussion on to to the students, to myself.
נהנתני אבל גם תצוגתי. זה דברים שהוא משתמש בהם.
He wants to hear others. He's not going to continue lecturing here. He will intervene, he will respond, he will ask, but he just won't sustain a lecture because he wants to hear the students. So this is like Elihu's maybe last experience as a teacher, and here's the class. He had one problem as a mentor. He didn't really want to lecture or to say anything. He wanted to listen. He wanted to learn. He wanted to understand. He wanted to engage me, his students, in thinking together about issues that interested him, that emerged from our projects, from what we were working on. So his main problem as a teacher or a mentor was his curiosity.
Elihu was born in 1926. He grew up in Brooklyn. He attended the Yeshiva of Flatbush, which was a bilingual Jewish day school, and learned Hebrew at age 6. And he had the aspiration to be a circus manager, and realized that wrangling lions and elephants wouldn't really coexist with observing the Sabbath, and had to give up his big top aspirations, and decided that he wanted to be a journalist. And in 1944, graduated from Midwood High School and attended Columbia. The story of Elihu's dissertation, which became this famous book, Personal Influence, is itself pretty remarkable. It began well before Elihu arrived at Columbia. Lazarsfeld, working with a couple of other bureau colleagues, conducted a famous study of the 1940 presidential election, and they found that the media weren't changing many voters' minds. And in this famous last speculative chapter of the book they wrote about it, called The People's Choice, they imagined that there might be something they called the two-step flow of communication. And the basic idea was that media don't reach people directly. At least a lot of the time, messages from the media are relayed first to what they called opinion leaders, and only then the opinion leaders spread the messages to their acquaintances. And in order to test that idea, Lazarsfeld, the next year, conducted a study in Decatur, Illinois, 1945. And it was directed by none other than the maverick leftist motorcyclist sociologist C. Wright Mills.
And Lazarsfeld fought with C. Wright Mills. They separated. But I was the graduate student, and I did what I was told. And so I rewrote parts of this thing. I added some new data.
And so here comes Elihu in the early 1950s. All of them had failed in that project. And he was given the task and succeeded. He wrote up as his dissertation what became basically part one of this 1955 book, Personal Influence, which unquestionably is the most important book published in English in communication research. And here he was at age 29, first author.
The impact of personal influence was deep, and it was profound, and it was broad. And it altered the field forever, right? It got the field away from its notions of powerful effects. It got the field away from this notion of the hypodermic needle and said, wait a second, there are people there. And wait a second, those people have a role in receiving and interpreting and acting upon the messages that are sent from the media. So it switched the directionality, it broadened the understanding of process, and we really have Elihu to thank for that.
So I wonder what you'd say now about where you would stand with regard to the audience, uses and applications, the cultural studies, and I suspect that Sonia and Patty would have something to say, but that's too much of a question.
First, let me just respond with a joke, which seems not to work with this audience. Last night, everybody was laughing at my jokes. But one of my reasons for going to Israel is because communication in Hebrew comes out kommunikacja.
For Israeli academics, in some ways, the ideal arrangement is to have a permanent position, visiting position, somewhere else, so that you're not all the time in what is, to some extent, a very isolated pressure cooker of a small country.
After he defended his dissertation, Elihu moved to the University of Chicago's sociology department. He worked there until the late 60s, but beginning in 1963, he and Ruth moved to Jerusalem, and he took up a post at Hebrew University in the sociology department. And that was another moment when he commuted. In fact, he once said that my whole lifetime is commuting.
Elihu's Jewish identity was always absolutely part of his core.
Elihu's connection to Israel just was. And I always saw it as an aspect of the fact that Elihu was a man of faith. And he was a man of faith, I don't mean that in the Jewish sense, I mean that he had faith in everything around him, in his students, in his colleagues, in his friends, in his enemies, and Israel was no exception to that. And when Elihu had faith in something, he stuck around, right? He believed in it. Elihu was also very loyal, right? Elihu does not abandon causes or friends or institutions that he felt had a reason for being. And I understand his fierce allegiance to Israel also in that regard.
It's impossible to understand Elihu as an intellectual, as a person, without understanding the way in which a certain Jewish perspective on ideas and thinking and ethics was woven into his being.
Katz was the founding director of Israeli television, improbably. In the 1960s, Israel didn't have television. They just had radio. And in fact, there was a lot of debate about whether they should have television or not. There was fear that if I Love Lucy was broadcast, that Israel would be too Americanized. That changed in 1967 with the Six-Day War, when Israel's leadership decided that they wanted to have television.
ערב טוב. ממשלת אלג'יריה התכנסה היום כדי לדון בגורל המטוס החטוף.
בעקבות מלחמת ששת הימים החליטו להקים טלוויזיה לשעת חירום, אז ביקשו ממני לעמוד בראש צוות הקמת הטלוויזיה. זאת הייתה חוויה בלתי נשכחת. זכיתי בפרס ישראל גם בתור סוציולוג וגם בתור ראש צוות הקמת הטלוויזיה.
Elihu was tapped to be the first director and managed to put together a service with its first broadcast a year later on the anniversary of the war.
You all know that Elihu sort of brought television to the Holy Land, which didn't like the idea so much, but at a given point when all the neighbors had already television sets, but they listened to foreign news. So the idea was that one needed to introduce television.
And the basic idea was to have the television like the tribal fire,
to unify the
people,
Israelis.
Especially to have also Friday night, which usually was religious, but I think, as Ima said before, being Abba very much connected to the culture and the Jewish culture, I think it was very important for him to create Friday night as a cultural aspect.
The minister in the government in charge of establishing TV demanded from Elihu the list of the people who will be interviewed in this very prestigious political interview show. He wanted to make sure that the political composition was right, so he wanted the list of candidates for appearing on this program. And Elihu said, it's okay, we'll take care of it. But the minister insisted, so Elihu said, you want to see the list? He went out of the office to the secretary's room, came back with a telephone book of Israel and said, here, this is the list of potential candidates for interviews on our programs.
Israel Broadcasting, his role in it was always part of what we knew about Elihu. But that's all it was. He never really talked about it. He never really talked about the very influential follow-up study that he did with the BBC. It was just something that he did and was part of his kind of background. The thing that I think I took away from that, however, is that his journey across Israel television for the 2 years he was there and his follow-up journey with BBC, they were both testament to the fact that the field has legs in the world, and it's important that we remember that they're there.
For him, this was transformative. He called it the new Katz, that he was reborn again. In the early 80s, Elihu took a post at USC, at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, Annenberg West, as it's known, and worked on a number of his most important projects while commuting back to Jerusalem for half the year.
And from then, I've had this long association with the Annenberg School at USC, and then I like to say I was traded to the Annenberg School. And now somebody said, traded for Larry?
Elihu's halftime, his fall role at USC Annenberg, lasted until the early 1990s. In the early 1990s, when Kathleen Jameson became the dean of the Annenberg School at Penn, one of the things we discussed early on was whether or not it might be possible to recruit Elihu.
Kathleen Hall Jameson, who was the dean of the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School, Annenberg East, reached out to Elihu and said, "Why don't you come here?" And Elihu, as he liked to say, was traded from Annenberg West to Annenberg East and commuted yet again. He spent September to March every year here in Philadelphia and then would travel back to Jerusalem to be with his family for the balance of the year.
So we had a photographer come in and take some pictures of the Gabriel Tarde office that Dr. Katz and I kind of inhabited for the better part of a year. And I don't know, it's just something very special about this moment, being able to spend some time, we'll spend a lot of time with Dr. Katz in this space and kind of crafting what is it that we wanted our book to say and do. And it all took the form of these epically giant posters that I had to write on, and Dr. Katz would kind of like yell at me and I would be scribbling furiously. So you know, just really wonderful, wonderful memories of being able to work with a legend in our field.
Lots of Elihu's remaining decades of productivity were centered on this figure, Gabriel Tarde, a French sociologist from the 19th century. And in a way, as he said at times, this was a return of the repressed, because Katz, in his doctoral defense, was embarrassed by Robert Merton, who asked him who had debated Emile Durkheim in the 1890s.
And Dr. Katz did not know the answer. And the answer, of course, is Gabriel Tarde. So I think, as Dr. Katz would tell it, that is what began his lifelong conversation with Tarde. And it really was a conversation between the two of them. So I joined the Dr. Katz Gabriel Tarde project late in its life. I mean, I was one of a series of research assistants Dr. Katz had, I think, over 20 or even 30 years, working on this one essay that Gabriel Tarde wrote called Opinion and Conversation. I was hugely intimidated by Dr. Katz. He is not an intimidating human, and I remember one time we were meeting, and I was taking notes, and he would talk, softly, and we'd engage, and I was writing down what he was saying, and I was agreeing with him, and he's like, you don't have to agree with me all the time. Elihu Katz telling me, you don't have to agree with me. In fact, I think he wanted me to disagree with him. And I wonder now, 10 years later, if he was nudging me maybe to find my own voice and perhaps not be so deferential.
One of the things that made Elihu different from other luminaries in the field was that there was just no one too young or too junior who he wouldn't seek out and then genuinely listen to. All of us have had that experience. The way he treated graduate students as true colleagues was unrivaled by anyone else who had his stature.
He had this endless capacity to pick on new projects. Anything interesting in the world was game, and it was never a problem of prioritizing, because there was a community of scholars. We do this together. You'd be responsible for this. I'll take responsibility for another aspect. We'll focus on this project now, but don't forget to look up everything. He wouldn't give up any project by prioritizing other projects. The entire world fascinated him. His colleagues were his friends. His friends ended up as his colleagues or people to think with about problems.
Elihu wrote numerous books. The books he wrote with several colleagues are the work they're best known for. He brought out qualities in his collaborators because of a kind of generosity of engagement. He was always interested in your ideas, even if he would then give them back to you in a more polished form. Anywhere that Elihu went, he would sort of raise the level of intellectual seriousness and engagement, not in a competitive way, but in a collaborative way, because he was always engaging with his colleagues and his students in terms of their ideas and basically improving them.
It used to be an ethnic joke, which our son doesn't allow me to tell. So I'll transform it slightly.
Go for it.
Saying that there are some people who leave without saying goodbye, and some people who say goodbye without leaving. And this, I think, is a culture of people who say goodbye without leaving.
It's safe to say that there are few people whose fingerprints are so pervasive across decades of communication and media research.
Elihu's impact on me as a scholar was hugely primordial. From him I learned how to love ideas, and from him I learned how not to be afraid to change the things I thought. And one of the most unique and valuable aspects of Elihu's scholarship is he was contradicting himself all the time, all the way, right? I mean, there were some things that stayed stable over time, but there were many arguments that he kind of adjusted along the way. And that was something that I learned from him. Never to be afraid of an idea, never to be afraid of its texture, never to be afraid of the fact that if you leave it, that it won't have its own place, you know, in the evolution of how we think about things.
His impact is monumental. I mean, I think not only because he was part of the group that founded the American study of communication, but also the longevity, literally the longevity of his career and his life. He had the opportunity to touch so many people. And so I think his legacy will be one of, yes, a founding figure, but then also of this tremendous mentor who not only, you know, brought that spark into a flame and became the field of communication studies, but also the people that he touched along the way.
I was, like lots of other people close to Elihu, shaken by his death. We had corresponded just a few days before. At the same time, I realized that we were pretty lucky in the sense that we had Elihu for so many decades. He was 29 when he wrote the field-defining book, Personal Influence. And there's this common saying about scholarship that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. And we, in communication research, had this giant roaming among us for decades after.